You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. And now for a brand new show we hope you'll like. Geneology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Supplemental. Have hot takes. Will travel. Welcome to Mission Log Genealogy. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Ashley Thomas.
Each week on Genealogy, we dig into the back catalog of scripts and shows Gene Roddenberry wrote, examining them for the kinds of morals, meanings, and messages that often turned up in his most famous later work, Star Trek.
And very seldom do we double back on that trail, but this time we are more than happy to retrace our steps, because we're welcoming back to the show the one and only Mr. Norman C. Lau! Woo!
Thank you. Your checks are in the mail. I appreciate you indulging me to come on. Actually, I appreciate the audience for indulging me to come back on. It's a real thrill because it's a strange thing to be a fan of the show that you started on, right? And because of you both, right? Which is one of the reasons why I wanted to come back on, so I could talk about things with the hosts that I love listening to now. Isn't that great? I think it's so much better now.
I mean, that's better than shouting at your podcatcher.
That's true. Shaking my fist at hey, leave Paladin alone. I will not. I love him too much to sit idly by and not elaborate on some of the episodes that I didn't have a chance to talk about. So I've described this on Mission Log, on the Mission Log proper podcast, what happened during late May of 2024, this year, as we're recording this, because I'm sure that you're listening to this 10 years from now. I can almost guarantee that you will be. And so I had a medical leave of absence, and right around the time that Earl and I were trying to figure out Ella West as our next podcast, I wasn't able to do that. And then Ashley came on board and just killed it on your first show with Ella West. And I was enthralled by the balance that you guys have brought to the show, listening to you guys just take on this material, have this wonderful dynamic that I think it's really great that you're here, Ashley, bringing a perspective of watching 1950s male-dominated TV and having your spin on it, especially because of, one, Gene Roddenberry, but two, the way that Gene wrote for women at this time. And again, that's a question that can be discussed, debated, stretched. But I did have a couple of things I wanted to kind of share with you for later on, for the meat of this show. So that's why I'm here. And again, $40 is a very easy spend to get back on the show. $20 for both of you. That's what we agreed on.
You talk to us like we let you get back on the show. It's like, dude, you started it.
Yeah. You were here back first.
You know what? The great thing is, and John and I have said this before, it's like the great thing about Mission Log and the format is that the conversation continues, right? We want people to have these conversations and revisit the kind of work that has led us into the moments of becoming Star Trek fans. And that's basically the history, the breadth and the depth of his writing, for better or worse, right? Because not everything's going to be winners, and some of them are going to knock out of the park. But there's also the spectrum of what happens in between. And I think right now in the 24 episodes that he wrote for Have Gun Will Travel, you pretty much cover the spectrum. And for this particular supplemental, we're only going to be doing a portion of these because it would be too long. And we want to be able to give kind of like the recaps they're due, because there's a theory for both this episode and a supplemental episode to follow that I would like for all of you to at least keep an open mind about when it came to how I feel about Gene Roddenberry's plan for Paladin, if there was one. So stay tuned for the next segment.
Most intriguing.
Now, folks, before we get started, here is how you can reach us. Genealogy is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Those 5-star reviews are what help folks find us, so please leave one of those if you're so inclined. And remember, folks, your comments could be used on future installments of Geneology. And now, this week's trivia.
Well, not so much trivia as a minor point of order, but for those of you who are members of the Mission Log Patreon, Genealogy After Dark is a thing now. Those of you who enjoy showing up on Thursdays for Mission Log After Dark, those who have been asking for a similar catch-up chat after each week's episode of Genealogy, well, now on Wednesdays, you get your wish and more. Jeez, I sound like a Telosian. Not the haircut for it, though. When we last left things, Norm, there was a bit of a pause, and then I put out a little 5-minute thing that was like, hey, remember when we were going to talk about Ella West? We're still not talking about Ella West. And also, we're not talking about Bruno, because that's decades in the future. Okay, now it's time to talk again about Ella West, and pick up where you left off here.
Essentially, what happened was, there was a point in time where, like, Earl and I were going back and forth about, okay, so there was this great stride of work that Gene was putting out from week after week, or at least the scripts that we were studying and dissecting and reviewing. And, from the 3 that I was able to do, before my medical leave were The Human Treasure, The Hanging Cross, and then Helen of Abygginian. And we thought, because we liked Helen so much, Helen of Abygginian as a script and what it stood for, and he won an award for that script, we would logically think, wow, the next episode that we cover is going to be just a step up from that script. Oh, no. Right? Because I think you and I kept going back and forth. Like, are we reading the same script? Are we watching the same episode? Is this the same Gene Roddenberry? How do we actually say this on the air? Well, there's no better way of saying it than being honest about it. And my short synopsis is, this may have been our first truly disappointing Gene Roddenberry episode so far. For the script, my other subnote here is Ella West, Ashley coming out strong right from the gate, because I freaking loved your guys' show on this. Up until my absence, Earl and I were always impressed by Gene's ability to weave in a certain level of nuance in his scripts, especially where women were concerned. And just previously in Helen of Abygginian, literally episode 116 to Ella's 117, Helen was a far stronger female character who knew her worth, her expectations, and then how to exactly get what she wanted and when she wanted it, right? And then Ella West happened and made us all kind of like collectively scratch our heads and wondered what happened. Because Paladin, to be honest with you, was kind of lecherous in this episode. And it didn't really fall in line with his character up until this point. So all I can really speculate is, when you're writing in volume, some are winners and some are Ella West. And that was my big take on it. I mean, aside from that, reiterating what you guys have already so brilliantly covered, that's just how I felt about it. After watching Ella West, I was not thrilled. So there is entry 1.
Okay, so you're talking about it in context of coming off of Helen of Abygginian, and then...
Correct.
Imagine going from that to The Hanging of Roy Carter. It's like arguably two of the peaks in Gene's writing for Have Gun Will Travel. And I think there's value in Ella West, but some of it is sabotaged by the script not being as good as it could have been in terms of what it was trying to achieve, although some of those are just kind of the core assumptions of the script. Ella needs Paladin to come in, ride in from the west and fix her. That's a basic assumption that I'm not sure you're going to get a good story from, no matter how you slice it. The other problem is, and I really strongly suspect this is directorial, because the actress who played Ella West, Norma Crane, she showed up in a guest role in a later episode in Laredo, but she delivered a fantastic performance in that episode, which was directed by someone else. And so I feel like some of the sabotage comes from directorial notes, like, could you please just be Yosemite Sam?
If I may, and I did tell you this before, but I want to make sure that we can explain that particular point, which I think is really valid. So I'm also a fan of the old-time radio Western production of Have Gun Will Travel with John Daner as Paladin and then guest stars for that radio show. And many of, if not all of Gene Roddenberry's scripts made it to the radio show. And listening to Ella West, there were adaptations in segments of the script that made her plight, like just the dirt poor environment that she needed to escape from. And Tracy kind of like pulled her out of that. Tracy actually being kind of like the stronger male figure that was needed at the time. That was a little bit more fleshed out. It was also, the Gene Roddenberry writing credit was still part of the radio show towards the end. So I get what I think Gene wanted to convey in the script, but it actually came across better without the over-the-top wannabe Annie Oakley, wannabe Calamity Jane type of performance that we were getting, from our actress in this episode, which I think it was a little distracting because the turn was so quick. But if you don't have these peaks and valleys of extreme personality disorders with Ella West, then you actually get to see the nuance and the pain, the woundedness of this character and how emotionally fragile she was. And the way that Daner played it, it wasn't, let me see how many lines of poetry I can impress you with before you turn into the Liza Doolittle to my Henry Higgins. You know what I mean? And that's where I felt like, okay, somewhere along the line, there was a loss in translation.
That's intriguing about the radio show, because I have not heard the radio show.
I haven't either, so now I'm going to have to go hunt that down. I would be really curious to watch the episode again and then put it side by side with the radio adaptation. All right, Norm. Next up, we've got The Hanging of Roy Carter, which, as I mentioned on the recording, it was such a stark change from Ella West. It felt like a good palate cleanser for me. So, what did you think about Hanging of Roy Carter?
Well, I actually start with a question, or several. Is revenge a dish that is best served ever? Is justice nothing more than adhering to a mortal set of mortal laws, devoid of logic, compassion, and reason? Is murder in the eyes of the law justice? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and another man's son for your son. Very powerful line. Very powerful line in that episode. This is an interesting return to form with this cautionary tale of the inflexibility of law and morality. The punishment must fit the crime. But in this case, the crime was the hardening of the human heart, and the punishment is suffered by all those who defy Judge Bullock's wrath. However, the most interesting character in this episode for me is the chaplain, trapped between religious moral law and mortal justice. But what good is religious moral law when the laws of man are so askew and out of balance as they are on Judge Bullock's scales? Also, when Chaplain April, I love hearing the last name April, right, in Gene's earlier scripts. When Chaplain April wounds himself on the saw blade and snaps it in half, the reference to the stigmata was interesting. It's an interesting choice. A la the moment when doubting Thomas places his fingers in the wounds of Jesus, proving he is risen, or in the chaplain's case, his belief in justice has risen over his self-doubt. So again, Gene isn't really kind of like an bonk on the head type of bringing the religious allegory or anecdote, to the fore. But when it's there and it's done with the kind of nuance that he's capable of, it makes you kind of look at, why is this character important? You saw Judge Bullock, saw the dad, you even saw Roy Carter. All the key players are there doing the right thing for the right reason in terms of their character arcs, except for the chaplain, right? And you just okay, where are you going with this, Gene? And it's basically goes back to the old saying, the way that evil flourishes is for a good man to do nothing. right? And this is the Old West. This is like, well, it's either you do something or someone dies. So, and a man of the cloth, he has the book that says, I have the law that is morally superior over mortal law. But why aren't you using that? Why are you afraid to do it? It's because for some odd reason, somewhere along the line, you doubted yourself. But why? And we never got to that point. That's the one thing about the script that I was like, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of why the chaplain, maybe like in his first tour of duty, he said like, you know what? I can't save this man. It's not my place. Of course it's your place. Saving lives is everyone's place, right? But he didn't do it. And it set a bad precedent for him. But yes, to your point, Earl, this was a way better script after Helen than Ella was, for sure.
I don't know that I have anything more to add to that, Norm. That was great.
That is still one of the high points of this show for me. I mean, not just Gene's episodes. That episode for me is a high point of the entire series.
Mm-hmm.
And I would happily go back and watch it again. I mean, it really is one of those episodes where you definitely get the impression, okay, this is where someone is starting to tee up Gene to create his own stuff, because they are taking notice and they're going, okay, this guy is pretty good at this.
Mm.
It's kind of funny in retrospect. In Gene's biography, did you know that he was given an award for his television writing reflecting Christian principles?
I did not.
Which is really funny because he was an avowed atheist by that point. But at the same time, however he might feel about this, he went ahead and accepted the award because I'm sure he understood that would be a help to his career. But the same people started trying to recruit him to write something much more distinctly religious, and he quickly lost interest in that exercise. Because that was going to be as much of a heavily supervised writing exercise as, say, West Point had been. And so I could see where, if from that perspective, even if no other, he lost interest in it. But it's interesting that his work was getting noticed, and the fact that he was working these themes into his scripts, even though that was not necessarily his belief system, people were also taking note of that as well.
I thought was interesting though with this, it's kind of the morals, meanings, or message kind of like echoes like later on in The Next Generation and Justice, where Picard says, to the aliens that are putting Wesley on trial, was it justice cannot be served, or there could be no justice as long as laws are absolute. So that's very Gene-ish, there's got to be a way to be able to negotiate the intricacies of, come on, what did this guy really do? Right? But the Judge Bullock was like, he broke the law, he must get punished, end of story. That's it. Case closed, move on to the next one. So yeah, it was interesting, kind of dissecting this particular character's pain and the projection that he had on everyone else that wasn't his son. There's something there, right? There's definitely something there. But now we move on to, we take the higher road to Wickenburg, right? Which is the next episode up. I'm going to go out a little outside the box on this because I love Westerns. I don't really talk about how much I love Westerns on our Patreon and our Discord, but I really do. So when I watched The Road to Wickenburg, I saw parts that inspired some of my favorites, like Silverado. Paladin starts off after being bushwhacked, right? And then the same character type in Silverado, played by Kevin Kline, the character's name is Paladin. Kind of sounds like Paladin, doesn't it? And so he gets bushwhacked. His personal belongings get taken, like his hat, his gun, all the stuff that makes him a cowboy. That's how that starts. And then you have kind of like a part Tombstone kind of feel to it, because basically this town in Wickenburg is run by the Earp family. Just a family of, our last name is Earp, therefore you do not mess with anyone whose last name is Earp. with the extension of holiday. So that's basically what they were. But you can feel this interesting, kind of like dynamic going on, because you have the cowboy, quote unquote, Paladin, coming into this town and kind of getting mistreated, obviously, and done so by the white hats in this town. So you have this whole like literal white hats. They're wearing all white hats in this, and very, very white skin, very, very blonde in this town, versus Paladin, darker skin, darker complexion, all black. What does that really say? So you have white hats, black hats. And the last name of that entire family is Goodfellow. Kind of generic white man, white hat kind of flavor. So even though like the black hat and the good guy is Paladin, there's also kind of really good reference to that type of black hat good guy in Yul Brynner's Chris from the Magnificent Seven. So there's like these themes running back and forth from Westerns after the fact. I also love this episode because it's a fantastic role reversal of the damsel in distress, as Paladin has met his match in Susan. Beautiful as she is capable, and is well-read to finish Paladin, or well-read enough to finish Paladin referencing a passage about trust and virtue. And unlike the way Gene wrote Ella West, Susan actually understands her agency and knows that Paladin does offer a better path forward, but without having to sideline her own strength for subservience. So I thought that was where I think Ella West could have been or should have been, but where it's like he's like making up for, like, yeah, I didn't really quite get there with Ella West. Let's write some better scripts.
Yeah, Susan kicked butt, because if I remember that one correctly, she's driving the getaway carriage, and she's got to get all that hooked up and teed up and ready to go, while he is, tap dancing, kind of stalling with the whole Goodfellow clan right in front of him. And so that is not a safe situation for either one of them. And again, she's having to get him back on his feet after he's had his butt handed to him off camera before the show even started. And, again, pointing to something we were talking about off mic with Paladin not needing to be a 10-foot-tall bulletproof hero who comes to no harm. The show actually quite frequently shows us he's got vulnerabilities. He doesn't always come out of every fight on top. And I really appreciate that, because we are already starting to see in other shows the beginning of the virtually impervious hero. No harm comes to them. They are not going to lose a fight. I much prefer this. I feel like it's much more realistic.
By the way, my favorite line, just because it made me laugh out loud, he fights like an Indian. You mean like Sam Houston? If you don't know that reference, folks, go all the way back in Genealogy where we covered Sam Houston.
Oh, okay. Hey, since you went there,
I did.
Let me put the question to you. How much of Sam Houston's DNA do you feel now that you've seen more and, rewatched all this stuff recently? How much of Sam Houston is there in Paladin? I feel like it's a lot.
I think we were on board with that when we actually broke down, Sam Houston, and, with the ring that has inscribed honor on the inside of it, and, being, kind of like not an Indian fighter, but a fighter for Indian affairs, and the whole, the appeal that he had in terms of just the stalwart, upfront, honorable American hero. Again, that's based on Gene Roddenberry's, take on it. But yeah, it's definitely a pivot. Paladin definitely is a pivot from that original archetype that Gene never got produced. And this is another point with watching just the Gene scripted shows versus the entirety of the 6 seasons of Have Gun Will Travel. It's not necessarily Gene's Paladin every single episode.
True.
This is an anthology series. We have, I don't think that I have seen, any kind of carryover yet in any of the episodes. So every one of these is a standalone in one way or another, except when you actually turn Gene's work into a cluster of work. then you actually get to see, did he actually have a through line for Paladin that manifests itself better in some episodes than others? And I am going to talk about that like later on as a theory that I've come up with.
So it's interesting because I had totally forgotten the line, he fights like an Indian. And making that Sam Houston connection was really cool. I'm thinking forward to Charlie Red Dog. Have you gotten to watch Charlie Red Dog yet, Norman?
Not yet, no.
There's a line at the very beginning of the episode where Charlie Red Dog asks Paladin if he has any Navajo in his blood or any Indian in his blood. I don't remember which. Paladin says no, but I've learned to appreciate the benefits. Just talking specifically about the meal that he was eating. I think that's a good idea of how Paladin treats Native Americans in, as we see him, interact with them in real time. It's a posture of curiosity and respect, which is really interesting when you look at something like Boots and Saddles, like what we just covered in recent memory, where they're always the nameless, faceless, savage bad guys.
He brought up a similar point in Helen of Abyginian, where how much of a connoisseur and also a curious nature of the Armenia people, right? Especially where like the groom to be was concerned, So I think that's part of the theory that I'm kind of putting together about this particular thread of Gene's Paladin. Now we're moving on to Juliet. This is an episode which is kind of like this weird in-between point that I have about how Gene's stylizing Paladin as kind of like this male role model for one reason or another. But first of all, Paladin's jacket is the bomb in this episode. I mean, it's been there before, but it just, at the very beginning of the episode, it was great to see that on display. Okay, so you have the Harpers versus the Pikes. Again, hearing another classic name from the history books of Gene scripts. April in one episode, now Pike in another episode. But you have Juliet in the balance. So you have Harpers versus Pikes, or Montagues versus Capulets, Union versus Confederate. It's basically, it's a take on Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet in a way. But then in the second act, you have this hayloft scene, and there's this return to the Paladin / Henry Higgins and the LOS / Eliza Doolittle energy now represented in Juliet, who, in my opinion, is far more entranced with Paladin being the older, mysterious, and worldly man who becomes so much more attractive when dodging Juliet's flirtatious advances. Quote, "Decency is holding on to the beliefs that keep us in check, but sometimes those beliefs can be stretched terribly thin, so that a careless act or even a careless word can break through them." Again, Juliet in this episode is 17 years old. Just keep that in mind. But still, even though his lesson's a little more nuanced here, it still comes off as a bit cringy, at least for me. Like, Paladin's sincerity is so real, it actually borders the comical. Now, I'm not sure if this is the side effect of Gene's writing, but the way that Boone performs, like, the tenderness of this moment, maybe it's perhaps like a little bit of both. But this particular scene just seems cringy for me. I wonder what you two thought, but I also wonder what the audience thought of watching kind of like this birds and bees moment between Paladin and Juliet. I almost half expected Paladin to start singing, "You are 16 going on 17, fellows will fall in line. Young lads and rogues and cads will offer you food and wine." I mean, it's that obvious. I just also wanted to sing a bit on the show, so, forgive me. The kiss at the end, I thought it was a bit much. I think for an actor whose like rugged good looks aren't quite the Hollywood quote-unquote leading man standard, this scene and all of the aforementioned birds and bees moments would probably have been easier to digest if, say, and these aren't related, people, folks, Tab Hunter or Jeffrey Hunter or Steve McQueen in his era of Westerns at the time played Paladin. Because they're the handsome hero, not necessarily the rugged, mysterious hero. So, I don't know. That was my take on it. Interesting continuity error, though. This is a little bit of trivia here, Earl. When in the hayloft with Juliet, while hiding from the two gunmen below the ranch main house, Paladin explains that his gun was designed with a 2-ounce trigger pull. In season 1 of the first episode, Three Bells to Perdido, in his opening cold quote, he says his handgun has a 1-ounce trigger pull, meaning the weapon is actually far more dangerous. And I wonder if anyone in 1959 actually caught that.
They were probably aired too far apart for that to register with people, but, still maybe he shot one more good fellow than he intended to and decided to have it adjusted.
Yeah. We need 1 less ounce. We need half the ounces.
Right. Still, it's funny to even hear stuff like that being discussed on American television, which is infamous for, across the board, not this show, not this genre, just all of it, very bad trigger finger discipline, and people not understanding how that works. But hey, it looks cool. So that brings us, Norm, to the Monster of Moon Ridge. Possibly one of our favorite episodes that we've covered, if not the favorite. How monstrous does this seem to you?
Well, I have here as kind of like, just to make sure that I mention this, for me, this was one of your best shows. Like, I think that you guys came out of the gates really, really strong as this new team for Geneology. But I think that your enthusiasm for Monster of Moon Ridge really showed. And I think with the morals and meanings and messages combined, I was right on, I heard this and I was like, I am completely in line with what you all are saying. So I didn't really have like that much in terms of how this affected me, or if I wanted to talk about anything that was like maybe a little bit more, diverse or controversial. At the beginning, though, Paladin's response to Hey Boy's dragon tooth charm gift as a means of driving off evil, he said the modern New World way of doing it is equal parts reason and daylight. That's kind of like Gene's whole foreshadowing of logic versus superstition. So we're seeing kind of like that start to manifest itself a little bit. Paladin saying, there's going to be a like mysterious explanation away for things, or there's going to be a logical explanation away for things, which kind of like leads into the whole, if there are no monsters, then we are the monsters type of, motif. The sheriff confides in Paladin later on in Moon Ridge. He goes, well, you know how Injuns are ignorant, not like us. To which Paladin replies, a few moments ago, I was feeling very superior to a Chinese friend of mine. I forgot that he came by his superstitions honestly. He learned them from the cradle. I can't find any such excuse for you. That is about as pointed as it gets. And then the sheriff says, I ain't superstitious. And then Michael Scott says, well, I'm a little stitious. If you guys get that, good for you. Yep, he missed Paladin's very fine point entirely. And that, my friends, is the similarly pointed moral on display here. Cultural and racial ignorance, couched in the justification of a more subversive yet acceptable way of othering people described through a more palatable word, superstition. And you guys were kind of like, I was like right along there with you. I'm just like, fist pumping. I'm like, you guys are killing it. Paladin about seeing Maria on her private hideaway, run out of town by ignorance and prejudice. 2024. It's not any different than it was in 1959. So how are we learning things? And I hope we are. Paladin tells Maria, I do have respect for some things. Courageous, intelligent women, for one thing. Is this Paladin or Gene speaking here? Maybe a little bit of both. Wonder what the writer writes. And towards the end, Paladin said, ignorant and prejudiced people like to be deceived, and I think they deserve it when they are. Why confuse them with the truth? I remember both of you making a very specific point of this quote, because I think that is like the crux of this particular narrative. Now, if this isn't an indictment, and rightfully so, about right now in the world, today and especially in the United States, I don't know what is. The truth to these kinds of people is deception. And no matter the incontrovertible proof in front of them, it's like pouring water on someone and saying that they're wet. still can't even come close to making a dent in the sheer level of ignorance and hate that forged this impenetrable armor, I don't know what will work. But I really do like that you two focused on that particular quote, because you can stare at someone until they're literally red. You're in the red in the face and say, you are on fire, and they are burning to death. And they'll say, no, I'm not. I don't know what else to do about that. And neither did Paladin. So move on with better things of your life. And now we come to the last of the episodes that I have reviewed for this supplemental. And let me see actually if I can say this correctly, because I have pretty much mispronounced her name entirely over the course of our discussions. Maggie O'Banion.
Well done.
Maggie O'Banion. So something that I think made Earl chuckle a little bit in our offline conversations. For a soldier of fortune and gun for hire, Paladin certainly suffers his fair share of being bushwhacked by hired hands. Hired hands, not soldiers of fortune, not trained killers, but ranch hands. Does that make him a vulnerable and relatable hero to his audience? Or is this just Gene's take on how to prove a hero is more deeds than words and more substance over style?
A buddy of mine once pointed out in Next Gen, when you see, you encounter a new enemy, and of course you send your security guy after him. You send Worf after them. You establish that they are strong because they're able to throw Worf across the room. It's kind of this same thing as, this enemy is formidable because they're able to sneak up on Paladin. They're actually going to make it an interesting challenge for him, versus Paladin just being able to come in and, bang, 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 shoot everybody up, or take control of the situation without breaking a sweat. It's going to make for some more interesting storytelling.
It is a lot more interesting, I think, than to have like a relatable hero. I am going to kind of touch on that a little bit here when it comes to the quote unquote leading man handsomeness of the relatable hero, because there's almost this interesting spiritual continuation and narrative as a through line here with how Gene writes the female protagonists in, say, these first half dozen episodes that we've covered. Paladin always encounters the quote unquote lady to be and never the lady, right? Until he educates them in the actual ways of the world by illustrating to them through the use of, say, reciting poetry or showing his honor, his character, his quality, or even cooking, especially in this episode, that a real man is not simply a ranch hand, but an educated, sensitive, honorable, and most of all, reverent man, not just to ladies, but all women. And he deeply appreciates the gift that is not just women, but a lady. Again, this is the Henry Higgins energy. How many times have we heard quotes from these, first half dozen episodes where he's always talking about the virtue, the gift, the grace, the quality, the magnificence, the miracle of woman, right? So again, for Gene, it's a very consistent style and tone that he's taking with Paladin for this writing. Maggie tells Paladin midway through, quote, "Would you please stop staring at me that way? You unfortunately have a very forceful expression." And perhaps that is the real world reason why it's sometimes a bit cringy when Richard Boone shares these tender moments with the lady protagonist character, because he has that unfortunate and forceful expression. Did you guys feel any which way about that when it comes to him sitting with the quote-unquote lady-to-be and then just wondering where Gene's going with the older man, younger woman scenario?
See, one of my problems with Maggie O'Banion is that occasionally that intense or whatever forceful expression comes across as a leer. And I don't think that's intended. But Richard Boone has the features that Richard Boone has. And, we joke in the Discord about resting Boone face. Where he may look like he's pissed off and he's not really pissed off. But sometimes his natural tendency toward intensity works a little bit against him. And he's not a fresh-faced hero. He's obviously not young, although he was younger than I thought he was. Whenever I actually, the occasion first occurred to me to look it up, it turned out, oh, he's younger than I thought. His features read older, just because of the life that the actor has lived, and no one really seems to be taking that into account when they are doing a romantic plot or a romantic subplot. But also, standards were very different back then, and I am sure there was probably a healthy contingent of the female audience that did not mind Richard Boone at all. Because these standards do change. And, here's a guy on TV. Well, he was pretty enough to get on TV. Why wouldn't you like him?
I got annoyed with everyone falling in love with Paladin in every episode. Except for in Monster of Moonridge. But in particular, Maggie O'Banion, he's trying to tell her, your foreman is stealing from you. And she's all like, oh, Paladin, you're so dreamy. Why don't you love me? And I'm all like, she didn't even sound like that. I don't know why I started talking with that accent. I'm so sorry for everyone listening.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That was me trying to feign dreaminess over Paladin, I guess. He's like, girl, I'm trying to tell you, this guy's stealing from you. And she's like, oh, Paladin, please recite more poetry. And
tell me why you're kissing me.
Yes.
I really want you to do your next future podcasts with that voice.
Okay.
Please.
Challenge accepted, my friend.
There you go. I dig it.
Good luck editing, Earl. I'll send you a case of Diet Sunkist. You might need it.
Always handy. Always handy.
Also, that cookie character is one smart cookie. No pun intended, but there is a pun intended. At the end, she tells Maggie about Paladin, quote, clean, cook, fight, run things. You'll never get help like that again. To which Maggie wistfully replies the same sentiment, meaning Paladin is the paragon of what a man should be in the eyes of a young lady. Speaking of being a lady, there's a lady slash servant slash buttercup slash Wesley energy here that would make S. Morgenstern and Rob Reiner blush. Because there's literally, when she drops that tray, she's like, Wesley, fetch me that picture.
Yeah.
It's literally the exact same energy. Now, I know that not everyone has seen all this stuff, and because, you know what? You have seen more Sunlight than me, and that is great. But I'm just giving you a reference here just in case you see The Princess Bride again. As trivia goes, this is pretty interesting. As far as Gene episodes are concerned, this is the first episode that I have watched with a new credit sequence, where the traditional Paladin cold opening quote doesn't exist, and where there's a new direction to how Paladin draws and points his gun towards the camera, and that traditional staccato four-note theme, that dun, 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 is a little bit different. There's also a very fast jump cut that focuses the attention squarely on the holster signature chest piece. Here's a weird thing, though. The branding is working, but the knight emblems are different from the medium close-up of the holster to the actual final close-up of the actual icon in the credit sequence.
Ooh, didn't catch that.
Okay, but I think here's where that happens. So obviously that fast draw and the camera zooms in on him really quick.
Yeah.
That is new footage. But the close-up on the holster is the original open because it costs money to put the words "have gun will travel" over that, and they're not going to spend that money again. So I don't think in that context, no one was worried whether or not the chess piece matched up.
Right. This is like the luxury that we have, being able to literally like watch a show from 1959 on an iPad at 3 a.m. with a bowl of, granola. I mean, I am spoiled. Sue me. But that's the way I was watching it last night. And when I saw that, I'm like, wait. There's a continuity error here. How dare they? Well, they dared. And the thing is, like, the actual chess piece itself, because they were talking about the close-up of the foreman, like, collecting souvenir-type guns and things like that, it is the chess piece that's on the season 1 credits. So for some odd reason, they decided to, I don't know, what did they lose the holster somewhere along the way and have to film a new holster?
Richard Boone took it home. That's my theory.
You did. I boondoggled that.
folks, we've only got so much time in a podcast to cover only half of the Have Gun Will Travel Gene episodes, so we're going to do this in 2 parts. In the follow-up episode, Norman is going to return to cover with us the return of Roy Carter, episode in Laredo, Les Girls, The Posse, The Golden Toad, Tiger, Charlie Red Dog, El Paso Stage, and Atlas.
Yep, and that may not necessarily be next week. Next week we are having Norm back to cover an episode with us, which I'm super excited about. Anytime we're having an episode, we always invite you all to listen in. But for right now, Norm, let's bring it in for a landing, buddy. I am glad you have finally got to catch up with all of Paladin's adventures here. What are your final thoughts here on this batch of episodes?
So I think a lot of us are fans are like the compilation collectors, where we like finding like those kind of like chunks of DVDs or collectible stories. Say, for instance, in Star Trek, this has nothing to do with like a Gene reference, but at one point in time, there were like 4 or 5 compilations of like the best of Captain episodes, the best of time travel episodes, the best of et cetera, et cetera. What I feel about these episodes that we've covered so far, and these 7 to 9, because some of these I covered, with Earl earlier on. But the ones from Ella West to Maggie O'Banion, the ones that Earl and Ashley covered, all of them combined feel like a very encapsulated, very specific narrative of Gene's version of Paladin. Because if you are a fan of Have Gun Will Travel and you want to watch it in its entirety, some of the episodes, they paint Paladin in a different way. There's a different characterization and a different narrative structure to this character, and rightfully so, because there are a myriad of different writers, directors, producers. But in this case, looking at like at least right now, 12 of the 24 episodes, or maybe like a little bit more than 12 of the 24 episodes of Gene's entire body of work that is Have Gun Will Travel, we're seeing a setup for Paladin that may or may not be working for some people, because some of these episodes do work and some of them don't. So one of the main through lines in most of these episodes that I've seen so far is this narrative of Paladin educating and at times fending off the attraction of younger women. Now, is this something that Gene found necessary to focus on, and perhaps using Paladin's nobility and virtue, his quality, as a way for the predominant audience for this show, namely boys and adolescent men, to learn how a man should treat women? I mean, this is the 1950s, right? This is 1959, and we've had offline discussions about the responsibility. I almost did that in a Kirk voice. The responsibility for knowledge and advancement. Sorry. The responsibility of these shows illustrating how a certain person of a certain age and gender should behave. Now, there were only, as far as I know, 3 networks on air in 1959. And one of these networks, CBS, that showed Have Gun Will Travel, have a very specific audience to cater to. In between selling cigarettes, in between some of the other advertising that they've done. But it's a very manly show, right? Back in the day, there were 3 different types of archetypes of shows. You had soldier shows, combat shows, you had detective shows or cop shows, and then you had the Westerns, which pretty much dominated like the majority of the networks. The top 8 shows of the time, I think we talked about this, Earl, were Westerns, right? So you couldn't throw a stone without hitting a Western. Whether those Westerns were good or bad, didn't matter. They were on the air. Right, so that's a sticking point when it comes to creating a type of character like Paladin. Now, Paladin at times even, well, from my perspective, comes off a bit heavy-handed in the way he talks to women, quoting poetry and the like. But he's always, pardon the pun, because, he is a knight without armor in a savage land, but he is armored in a certain chivalrous polish to his armor. Right? He never abuses that trust per se, and he certainly doesn't use his prowess to intimidate or coerce. Most of the time, he's actually pushing women away, especially in the case where Juliet is concerned. So perhaps Gene was using this platform to weave a certain narrative and show his Have Gun Will Travel audience of boys and young men what life can be like by emulating his Paladin's version of the code of honor and ethics that he's maturing so far. I haven't seen the second half, of which we'll cover in the aforementioned supplemental, but there is a clumsiness to it right now that's starting to shake loose. And I'm wondering, in the back half of these, we're going to see a little bit more polish with Paladin's character. But again, that's for a different conversation. That's a theory that I've been working on right now in this first half cluster of Gene's work. And watching all 24 together, I'm wondering if there was a very specific story he wanted to tell. Remove those 24 episodes. Does Paladin's character remain intact as an overall Paladin archetype? So that'll be interesting to see. There's over 200 and something odd episodes, only 24 of which are Gene's. So I'm sure that it probably wouldn't really affect the overall stride of his character, but we'll see. I put it up to you. I put it up to the audience. What do you think about this theory? But that's where I'm coming from right now. And I am really thankful for the both of you of having me on, inviting me back, just so I can get this stuff off my chest and sleep well at night.
Glad to have you, Norman.
I think there may well be merit to this theory, but the problem about not abusing his trust or, his presumed authority position because of his age, and let's be frank, because of the era the show was shot in, his gender. The problem there is that he still goes in for the kiss at the end of Juliet. And with Ella West, if I remember this correctly, there's a big kiss going into an act out, going into a commercial break.
Yes.
Where it's like, whoa, what happened between there? It was almost, and I think, Ashley, we both kind of were like, did they or didn't they?
Yeah. I was like, is this a tactful fade to black? Because they're about to do the deed, and, we can't show that on TV in the late 50s.
Yeah, so it's, sometimes it almost seems like he is going too far, which, again, sadly, is maybe in line with the age, but it could be that in hewing to sort of the tradition that the hero gets the kiss at the end, gets the girl, in some way, even if it's just a kiss, sometimes it doesn't read the way that I think it was intended.
And I think that's why I brought up this point of, if Paladin kisses the girl, it's because he has the right and honor to kiss the girl. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I can see how it's written that way, as opposed to a ranch hand or a smarmy, one of the good fellows. Those guys they're bad guys, right? Mm. But they don't get the girl. The good guy that wears black gets the girl, because I'm above all that. I write poetry or recite poetry. I can cook. I don't just cook. I cook French cuisine and speak French. I speak poetry in French. I'm a guy. That's the man of the hour, right? Again, I don't agree with all of it, but is it better than the archetype heroes that were on TV at the time? That's what I'd like to know.
I would have to watch more of the archetype heroes at the time to know for sure. I will say, at least with Paladin, it appears mandated kiss at the end seems to be consensual. It's not like he's forcing it. All the girls are like, heck yeah, I get a smooch Paladin. Holla. They're all like, Paladin, you are looking so makey-outy tonight. And that works in the context, I guess. It doesn't make me feel any more comfortable with it. For the conventions of the time, I see how you got there.
And Norman, brother, great to have you back. You are welcome anytime.
That was fun.
Let's do this again, dude.
Yeah.
We should do a podcast.
Or something like that. Well, I mean, I definitely have the follow-up, so there's that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Mm-hmm. We're holding you to it.
Honestly, like, what you guys have done, where you've brought the show, that's the most important thing to me, right? And it's the vision that we can keep moving forward. It's the dynamic that you guys are bringing, the viewership and the listenership that's responding, and growing. I mean, that was the whole point. So, I mean, seriously, congratulations to the both of you. It makes me beyond happy that you guys are continuing on with this. And, every once in a while, if I want to pop in, please indulge me just in case I have something to say. But I am very well, set on listening to you guys and what you guys have to bring for future episodes, because you guys have a great formula working. So I thank you for that.
Thank you for, I feel like I got your blessing, Norman. So thank you. And I'm really excited that we got to podcast together today. Been listening to Mission Log for a few years now, and I always enjoyed getting to hear you. And then I was so excited when you and Earl were starting Geneology. So I feel really happy that we got to record together today. So first time. This is exciting. Very fun.
It's the dream team.
Mission Log Genealogy is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you may do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, please drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Genealogy, Karate. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Shabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
Or
Karate.
on the next Genealogy, Karate.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.